And we are live with another edition of the All Gas No Break Sports Show. I am one of your co-hosts, Nicholas Pavona, joined alongside once again by my co-host, Andrew Johnson, as we are now through 9 weeks of this year's college football season, and a lot to intake this past weekend, Johnson, in the world of college football. Some big games in the SEC, a near upset in the Big Ten, some movement in the top 25 polls as itself, and also to keep note of, next week, on Tuesday, as of this recording, it's October 28th, Monday, but next Tuesday will be the first release of the new college football playoff poll. So Johnson and I, later on in the show, will be giving our predictions as to what we think, or not later on in this show, excuse me, next week's show, we'll be giving our predictions as to what we think the first installment of the new top 25 poll for this 12-team playoff format that we have this season will be next week. But as for this week, Johnson, as I mentioned, some big games that happen in the college football world that could potentially shake up next week's top 25 playoff poll release on Tuesday night.
Yeah, another big week for college football. I unfortunately could not watch this past Saturday for personal reasons. However, I did catch up on highlights and I kept track of scores. So didn't get a full watch in for me last week, but there are a couple games which I did watch Thursday and Friday that were not on this this recap. But I think we can just go straight into it with that Texas A&M game, right?
Well, to save yourself from the Thursday Friday games, one of those games unfortunately involved one of my teams, and yeah, let's just say that game was over by the.
It was rough.
It was over by the third play of the game. Yeah, that was a rough game for Syracuse.
I would say it was. Yeah, I'll give you the fair. I was gonna say what between the first or second pick six.
It was. I'm not even kidding you, Johnson. I turned the game on. I said, okay, here we go. Big game, Syracuse fight. They win this game. They're in the top of the ACC standings, and they're going to be a ranked team next week. I'm not even kidding. 4 plays into the game, Kyle McCord throws the first of 3 pick sixes, the first of 5 interceptions he throws that night. And I go, oh, it's going to be that type of a game. It got so bad that I initially said last week I'd be watching this game over the Thursday night football game with the Rams and the Vikings. I immediately turned the Rams-Viking game on after McCord threw his second pick of the night. So, yeah, that was a rough game. Friday night was a better game between Boise State and UNLV. That was a big win for the Broncos, but I digress. Let's go into the Saturday slate, and let's get you a little bit more recap as to what happened Saturday night. And you talked about that Texas A&M game. We knew going into that game, it was a big fight field for both of these teams. Surprisingly, the last 2 undefeated teams in the SEC going into this game, if you had said this at the beginning of the season, a lot of people would be maybe be laughing at you because you have teams like Alabama, Georgia, and Texas. Those are the 3 teams you expected to be undefeated going into this station of the year. But that was not the case so far, and we have this game between 8th-ranked LSU and number 14 Texas A&M. And early on, Johnson, it looked like it was going to be LSU's game to win. They went into halftime with a 17-7 lead. A&M really was struggling offensively. It looked like everything was not going to go their way, and they were going to not come out with the victory in this game. But then they started to get some things clicking in the second half. Their defense was forcing pressure on Garrett Nussmeier. They forced him to throw a couple of interceptions. They even made their own quarterback change as well, as Connor Wegman got benched for Marcel Reed in this game. Reed got 3 rushing touchdowns coming in relief in this game. They had a very good, strong running attack as well with 245 rushing yards. And look at that, the second half score of this game in terms of Texas A&M for the victory in this one. They outscored LSU 31-6 in the second half of this game, and they now sit alone at the top of the SEC after this monumental win over LSU by the final of 38-23. They now go to 7-1, as I mentioned, are the lone remaining undefeated team in the SEC at 5-0. LSU now loses its first game of conference play. Still alive in terms of the SEC title game as well as the college football playoff, but they're now going to have to do some work, Johnson.
Yeah, Texas A&M is still alive and well, but like we said kind of last week, that this was LSU's last, this is your last mulligan. LSU still can make the college football playoff, like you did say.
Gotta be Bama now.
Gotta be Bama, so not ideal. Where Texas A&M, they have a mulligan now. So if they win the next 3 games, South Carolina, New Mexico State, Auburn, and they lose against Texas in Week 14,
they're going to be in.
They're going to be in. So it's and potentially they could still be in the SEC title game too. So they have a potential makeup game down the road too.
If they win their next 2 SEC games against South Carolina and Auburn, which are not gimmies, there's certainly going to be
no gimme games in the SEC
on the road. But they win those 2 games, they're in the SEC championship game no matter what. Because even if they were to lose one game, I guess it depends on the tiebreakers. I guess I maybe shouldn't say they should be in, because you have LSU with one loss now, but they have the tiebreaker over the head to head. You have Georgia and Texas who have one loss, but Georgia holds that tiebreaker. So there's a lot of things to still intake. I think if A&M is to lose that game against Texas, and Texas and Georgia have one loss at the end of the season, then that's where A&M unfortunately misses the title game, because Georgia beat Texas, Texas beat A&M, so therefore it's probably going to be a rematch of Georgia and Texas if that was to be the case in that scenario. But as you mentioned, A&M is now in the driver's seat to be in that SEC title game, and if they have no other faults in the next 3 weeks, they will be in the college football playoff as well.
Exciting, exciting times for the SEC because Alabama seems to be the team that has, it seems like a vanquished foe at this point, like the end of a dynasty, the end of an era for
And they still can
Alabama.
make it.
Kalen, and they still can make it, but you have all these teams willing to step up to play Texas, Texas A&M, LSU. You've had Georgia that's been established. You have all these other
Tennessee's been
teams.
all right.
Yeah, you have all these other teams waiting to kind of take their throne, and it's gonna be interesting to see what actually how this ends up towards the end of the year.
And we'll recap the top 25 polls in a little bit as to what happened, because there was some major movement in the top 10 as well. But yeah, the SEC is in a prime position to put a lot of their teams, probably four teams, if I had to guess, in the college football playoff this year. A&M's emerged as a team right now. We know Georgia and Texas were going to be there at the beginning of the season. Tennessee still has a good chance as well. LSU and Bama right now are the teams on the outside looking in, but they play each other. That's pretty much going to be an eliminator game, Johnson, those two teams facing each other. The loser is going to be out of the college football playoff. The winner is still going to have an outside shot to make it itself. So there is still some hope for those two teams throughout the rest of this regular season. Any other final thoughts on this game before we move on to the next game that happened in the SEC?
Yeah, A&M's been doing this pretty much with zero quarterback play. They have
Yeah,
7 wins with no quarterback play, and I say this as a Conor Wegman fan. I really expected big things out of him this year, and he had promise before the injury. I guess I don't know if that injury is still lingering or if he's not 100% healthy yet, but
it
I
was
don't. He hasn't been the same quarterback since that injury,
it was weird because that game against Missouri, he looked phenomenal. That was his first game back from that injury, and that
and
was
it's
a
been downhill since.
it's been ever. You're right. It's been downhill ever since that Missouri game. So I don't know if the injury now is coming back, and maybe he got like hit hard in one of these last couple of games. That maybe that's why it's happening. But yeah, he looked completely out of sorts in this game against LSU. And if not for the quarterback change and the defense playing strong in the second half, A&M's probably not only going to lose this game, but it's probably out of the college football playoff, barring if they were to beat Texas in the final week of the season. So they are very grateful that they're able to get this win, and many of their other wins seasons, despite the bad quarterback play they've had all year. So that is a good testament to what Mike Elko has done in his first year with this team. He's got them in a prime position to make the college football playoff for the first time since this new installment happened, especially with this teleteam format now. But even when they had the 4-team playoff format, they were not able to make it during that time as well. So a very good chance for the Aggies to get into the playoff this season. Now, another big game that we had in the SEC is a game that at the beginning of the year you probably just brushed it off and thought, well, this is going to be an easy win for the Texas Longhorns because they are one of the top 5 teams in the country. And this other team, Vanderbilt, has been known to have, unfortunately, bad success in the SEC in their university's history. But that has not been the case this season. Vanderbilt obviously pulled out that upset over Alabama earlier in the year, and they played a pretty competitive game this past weekend against this number 5 Texas Longhorns team. We kind of wondered, Johnson, how would Texas respond after losing to Georgia the previous week? Kind of a game where they just got beat on both sides of the ball. Nothing really went right for them in that game. And how would they respond in this game against Vanderbilt? And early on, it did not look like that was going to be the case. They were up only 14-7, but they trailed to start the game, giving up the leading touchdown to Diego Pavia. They did respond in the second quarter, taking a 14-point lead. A field goal gave Vanderbilt within 11 going into halftime. Texas would get a field goal back to make it go up 14. It was a touchdown game going into the fourth quarter. Texas defense did just enough early on in the fourth quarter to hold on to this lead. They would go on to win this game by the final of 27-24. So Texas early on in the season looked dominant, looked like the team to beat to win the national championship this season. the last two games, Johnson, have definitely been a concern for this team. A bad loss to Georgia at home, and now a very close encounter against this Vanderbilt team that has definitely been surprising this season. But Texas needs to really, up their game these next couple of weeks. They have that matchup with A&M to end the season, and they still have some maybe troubling games against teams like Florida and Arkansas and Kentucky before that A&M game coming up.
Yeah, obviously Vanderbilt. They have a return to. I was gonna say return to prominence. This is probably the most
This is
prominent
the
this program has been in
prominence.
40 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like you said about the Longhorn schedule, uh, they're hosting Florida. They're at Arkansas, hosting Kentucky. Then they're gonna be at A&M. So on off for the Longhorns the next month. Uh, if this game was at the Swamp, I would say okay, might lose this game. They're probably gonna smoke them here. The game that's at Arkansas,
That could be
that's a trap
troubling.
game. That's
Yeah,
a
that could
trap
be a
game.
trap game.
It wouldn't surprise me at all if they end up losing that game. If so, that makes the next two games even way more important for this
Yeah,
Longhorn team because they've come so far. Uh, they can't afford to lose this. I'm sorry.
right.
This is just
Yeah,
unacceptable at this point.
if they lose one of those games, then they have to be Texas A&M the final week of the season just to make the college football playoff. Because at that point, they wouldn't even make the SEC title game with two losses. You have to be a one-loss team pretty much in the SEC to make the championship game. So
Yeah, as sad as that is, that's the prerequisite.
yeah, the SEC is just that dominant this season. It's been that good of a conference. But we knew that going into the season, even before they added Texas and Oklahoma. We knew this conference was so good. Now you just added another wrinkle by adding a team like Texas, even though Oklahoma has been bad this season. But you added another top team like the Longhorns who made the college football playoff last season. It was, pretty much one touchdown away from being in the national championship game against Michigan. But I digress. Now, the final game that we have on our slate was a big matchup in the Big Ten that happened on Saturday night between the Nittany Lions and the Wisconsin Badgers. And Johnson, we knew going into this game that this could be a trap game for Penn State. This is a game that usually the last couple of years that they look ahead to their next opponent next week because upcoming this weekend they play Ohio State. And it looked like early on that was going to be the case. That Penn State was going to be going into some trouble. They went into halftime trailing 10-7. They had an injury at quarterback. Drew Aller, their starting quarterback, was injured. Did not play the second half of this game. So Bo Pribula had to start for the Nittany Lions in the second half. And not only did he have a good second half, but the Nittany Lions defense really showed out in the second half of this game. Penn State outscores Wisconsin in the second half by a score of 21-3. And after trailing 10-7 at the half, the Nittany Lions go on to win this game by the final of 28-13. Kind of what we've seen from Penn State this season, Johnson. Their defense has been a big reason why they're currently 7-0 on the season. But there is definitely a concern now going into this big game with Ohio State upcoming this weekend. Are you going to have your starting quarterback, Drew Aller, or are you going to have to go back to Pribula? And it'd be Pribula's by far his biggest game ever if he has to start in this game against the number 14 or the number 4 team in the country in Ohio State.
Yeah, I think this all comes down to coaching and recruiting. Uh, Wisconsin has tried to take back their mantle of being a premier team in the Big Ten,
They're not there yet.
and I don't think they're ever gonna get back because I've said this a million times. They had a perfectly great coach, which they got rid of. They fired him for what they thought was a guy. The next guy was going to be his spiritual successor, and he's going to lead this program to greatness. Turns out, oh well, he's not the guy, so they have a new guy there now, and they still have the same rigorous academic standards. So I'm not for lowering the standards for athletes, but you kind of have to temper your expectations if you want to be a premier football team and a premier academic school. You can't have both. Duke knows it. And that's why their football team kind of suffers a little bit. UNC kind of has the same problem. Stanford definitely has that problem. And
Yeah.
to think that Wisconsin's going to be the exception to the rule is just preposterous.
Yeah, Wisconsin.
It's a talent disparity at this point, and you'd have to be
There's
blind to
there's
say
just
otherwise.
they had this problem even before the Big Ten expanded. Like they were struggling against teams like Penn State, and they were struggling against teams like Ohio State and Michigan. And now you're adding teams like Oregon this season. USC obviously has had a great year one in the Big Ten, but you're adding them. You're adding UCLA, and you're adding all these other schools as well in the Big Ten. And look at the new wrinkle as well we have this season with Indiana. I mean, they've even been phenomenal this season what are they, 8-0 now on the year, 5-0 in conference.
They
I mean,
got that Mark Cuban money.
I think it's really coming down to it's like Wisconsin is just I don't want to say they're settling to be in the middle of the pack right now, but that's exactly where they are right now. Like they're in the middle of the pack, and that's probably at best that they're going to get past the rest of this season and maybe for future seasons, unless something does change within that program. I know, the biggest issue for their team has been quarterback play, and they thought they got that with Tyler Van Dyke, the transfer out of Miami, but then he gets hurt early on in the season. He's been out for the rest of the year since then, and that I guess that's they're trying to play it off as if, oh, if we had Van Dyke, we'd probably be better. Maybe we even win this game. I'm not necessarily sure if that's even the case. I don't think they still would have won this game even if they had Tyler Van Dyke starting. But yeah, I don't know. They have to figure out. I don't know what exactly they can do to make themselves get back
They
into.
need to lower their recruiting standards. That's what
Yeah,
it is, because
I
they
guess.
have so many 3-star guys. Because oh yeah, if you want to play football at Wisconsin, you need the 2000 SAT score. And I feel like this is a broken record. I've said this a million times.
I know.
You can't have the guy that has a 2000 SAT score. Oh yeah, I've got the 2000 SAT score, and by the way, I run a 4.40. It just doesn't happen. You're asking for unicorns in this situation.
Yeah.
And I
So
think I think the second they do lower academic standards a little bit, so they accept better football players, they're gonna have a better program. There's a reason why some of these even academic schools, like let's say, like for example, I mentioned Duke before. Duke has a great basketball program, so does UNC. Basketball team can be, if you have 2 or 3 really good guys, that's it. Like that's it. You don't need a football. You need at least 15, 20 guys on a football team to be really good, to be competitive,
right.
especially in the Big Ten. And unfortunately, that's just not going to happen at Wisconsin. You're not going to find 15 to 20 football players that have a 4.0 GPA and a 2000 SAT, or I guess a 1400 SAT, because they got rid of the free part now. Excuse me. Uh, they're pretty much looking for 10 Christian McCaffreys and 10 Nick Bosas. That's what they're looking for right now. And they don't grow on trees.
That they definitely do not grow on trees. That is for sure. So we'll see with the university what they do the next couple of years, I guess, because they're still a far ways ahead from being at the top of this conference. But for Penn State now, Johnson, we know they got a big win, and now they have a big game upcoming this weekend. A game that, unfortunately for them, has not treated them well in years past. If there was ever a time that maybe they can get the victory over Ohio State, maybe this is the time they can do so. We'll preview that game before we wrap up today's show. But before we go into the mushing hour, let's go into the final time this Johnston, or maybe the second to last time, I should say, that we'll be looking at the AP Top 25 polls. As I mentioned, next week on Tuesday, it will be the college football playoff poll. The first poll will be released next Tuesday. We'll give our recap of the last AP Top 25 poll next week, and then give our predictions as to who will be in the college football playoff poll going in to that show on next Tuesday night. So, looking at our second to last AP Top 25 poll of the season, some movement at the top of the polls. We saw now Miami is into the top 5. Texas's close call against Vanderbilt. They moved down a spot. So Miami is in the top 5 for the first time, I think, since the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. It has been a while since this program has been a top 5 team, but they are now currently the number 5 team in the country. Notre Dame, we saw what they did against Navy, an absolute beatdown of the midshipmen at MetLife Stadium this past Saturday. They forced 6 turnovers in that game, rolled past Navy 51-14. They are now into the top 10 for the first time since early on in the season, since they lost that game to Northern Illinois. They're the number 8 team in the country. BYU is now into the top 10 at number 9, and Texas A&M, after their big win over LSU, is now into the top 10 for the first time this season at number 10 alone. So big win for the Aggies. Now puts them, as we mentioned earlier, in the driver's seat to potentially get in to that college football playoff spot. We see 2 teams at 11 in Iowa State and Clemson, who currently lead their respective, or one of them, I should say, leads their respective conference in terms of being at the top of their standings. Clemson right now is in tie with Miami for conference standings wise, but is second because of that one loss to Georgia. Indiana is still undefeated. They still need to do some work to make the college football playoff, it looks like. And then, as we mentioned earlier, that Bama and LSU game now, Johnson, is most likely now an eliminator game, with Bama being 14 and now LSU dropping 8 spots to 16. The loser of that game is definitely going to be eliminated from the college football playoff, and the winner of that game not only keeps themselves alive in the SEC title game hope, but keeps themselves alive for the college football playoff hope as well. So that's a big game coming up for those two teams. I believe that game is in 2 weeks for those two teams. And then before we do any notes about the top 25, the other teams to mention, we saw some movement from SMU and Army after their last couple of games. Two new ranked teams in Washington State and Colorado. And we see Illinois and Missouri, despite their losses this past weekend, just staying into the top 25 polls. Illinois at 24, Missouri at 25 to round it out. So, Johnson, anything that stood out to you the most from looking at this top 25 going into now week number 10 of the season?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up Colorado because this is a team that they may win the Big 12.
Yeah, they've been
It's
getting better
very
and better.
possible now. I think they're heating up at the right time. I know they're better than teams like TCU, Texas Tech, West Virginia, those bottom tier teams below them. I think they're better than Kansas State, and I think they're better than Iowa State and BYU. So I think if they could just get into the
Well,
title game picture, all they have to do is get
it,
into the title game picture. So for them to do that,
they need
they
someone
need
to
a clean
lose.
house. Yeah, they
They
need to
have
win out, and they
they
need
have to
one
win
of those
out.
three teams to lose.
Right. They need to win out, and that loss to Kansas State obviously now looms larger because that hurts them in terms of head to head. But if you look at their last couple of games, they're facing Texas Tech. That might not be as winnable. That probably would be a high scoring game, but you would think Colorado could probably edge them out. Utah is by far not the same team we expected at the beginning of the season. They have really faltered since the beginning of the year. In fact, Johnson, our two picks to win the Big 12 at the beginning of the season
Yeah,
are
Utah and Oklahoma
two
State. I know.
are
I don't
two
want
of
to
the
talk about
bottom
it.
teams in the Big 12 this season. It's been a rough year for that conference in terms of what we expected at the beginning of the year. Kansas is also another team at the beginning of the year that people expected. They were ranked to go into the season, and they are right now at the bottom of the conference as well. In fact, the last three teams that Colorado plays, I believe all of them were top 25 teams to start this season. They are now all unranked. They are now all at the bottom of the conference, and they could be easy pickings now for Colorado potentially to get themselves into the Big 12 title game. But as we mentioned, they still need help. Now, you look at the teams ahead of them. Iowa State and Kansas State have to still play each other at one point. That's the last game of their both respective seasons. So there's going to be a loss there. If you're Colorado, you obviously probably prefer Iowa State to win that game so that Kansas State gets that second loss. But they would also need Iowa State to lose at some point or BYU. And at BYU, if you look at their schedule, it's not really that tough as well. It's kind of looking
I
easy
can
for them as
see Iowa
well.
State losing the last two games of the season. I can see them losing to Utah, a team that has pedigree, and then I obviously can see them losing to Kansas State.
I can see them losing to Cincinnati as well. I think Cincinnati. I watched the game between Cincinnati and Colorado this past Saturday, and Cincinnati put up a good fight with Colorado for the most part of that game. There was just I think there's really realistically one drive that pretty much decided that game for that team. They had a fourth down that was turnover on downs, and that was the game deciding factor in that one between those two teams. If that did not happen, they very well could have gone on the road and pulled off what a lot of people maybe consider to be an upset in that game. So Cincinnati definitely could pull off some trickery, and they also play Iowa State as well as BYU. So I think there's still, or not BYU, excuse me, they play Iowa State, but I think also for these two teams, BYU hasn't looked dominant their last couple of games, so they could fall to maybe any of these teams. Realistically, it could happen, but um, like I said, for Colorado, they need they need Iowa State to beat Kansas State, and then they need either Iowa State or BYU to either lose one or two games, it looks like. And they obviously have to win out. That looks like their path right now to make the Big 12 title game. And if they do, then they're probably in the college football playoff as well.
What a wild time to be alive. To see Deion Sanders, Travis Hunter, Shador, all those guys in the college football playoff. That would be must see TV, and I know some TV executives are probably rooting for that.
And I'll tell you what, because with the rumors that this could be his last stance at Colorado too. I would not be surprised if this is the last time you see Deion at Colorado. There's
Goes
a
to
lot of
Florida State.
with the way their season's going, I think it's more
Anything
likely
is possible.
it could be more likely than ever that maybe he goes to Florida State and becomes the head coach of the Seminoles because why not? I mean, they're 1-7. I really hate Cal for depriving us of a potential 12-0 to 0-12 1 year span. That realistically could happen this season. Florida State has a good chance to be 1-11. It's just been that bad. But I digress, Johnson. Let's now go in to the mushy hour for week number 10, and I won't sugarcoat it. We've been red hot as of late, I would say, in college football. Maybe not red hot, but like we've been better as of late. Last week was not a good week for both of us.
No.
You went 3-5. I went 2-6. I really wish I didn't pick that Syracuse game because that one tore my heart. Not only because I wanted my team to at least win or cover, but they got absolutely blown out and they lost the game. So
I think after going 9-4 for me to going 3-5, that's kind of like a big fall
yeah,
off.
you're still trying to get your record better up, and now my record's getting worse, unfortunately, as well. So I need to get my record back
Hey,
up
I'm still killing it
where I
in the
want it.
NFL, so I'll take it.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the NFL tomorrow when we record our NFL episode. We have one more game left in the NFL slate that is tonight. Unfortunately, it's the Giants playing that game, so not looking forward to that game. But I am looking forward to the college football slate that we have in week number 10, Johnson. And let's kick it off with some ACC action and maybe a game that not a lot of people maybe had circled on their calendar to begin the season. One team that we did in particular expect to be in the spot, being Miami, is still undefeated. They are the number 5 team in the country, and they are at home against Duke, who almost pulled off a big win this past week against SMU, but they had a blocked PAT and a missed 2-point try. Unfortunately, cost them the game in overtime. They lost by 1 point to the Mustangs. So they now go to Miami this weekend to take on the Canes. They are a 20-point underdog with the over-under set at 54.5 in this one. What do you got for this game?
Duke plus 20. I just don't see them. I know they almost. I think they lose to UConn or they barely beat UConn early in the season. I forget.
Uh,
I
they
know it was close
definitely
against UConn, so that
they
just
definitely
shows
beat
you the
them because
quality of competition.
their only losses this season are against Georgia Tech and then this last game against SMU.
All right, so I know they barely only beat UConn, but I'm gonna say they keep it close against Miami.
Yeah,
Give me Duke plus 20.
26-21 they beat UConn.
Yeah,
They also had a close
give
encounter
me
with
Duke plus 20.
also a close encounter with Florida State. The way the season's gone too. Oh boy. Um, I always hate these spreads when it's like plus 20 because even like we talked about it last week with Oregon and Illinois. Like we hated that spread, and albeit the spread was the right pick in that game because Oregon wrecked the Illini in that matchup. For me in this game, I'm going to go with the over. I think that's probably the safest pick out of this team, these two teams, because they can put up points. Miami's defense hasn't been that great this season, but we know they can put up points. And Duke's, they can certainly match up with some of these teams in the ACC, but they just have not been able to scrap out the wins against the top of the ACC. So I think they can keep it close. I think your plus 20 is definitely in line to hit, but I will take the over just to play it a little bit safe with this matchup. What is our next game that we have?
We are having the Oregon Ducks. They are a 14.5 point favorite, number one team in the country, going into Michigan, into Big Blues territory, the Big House. Michigan is at home. They are a 14.5 point underdog, over underslated at 44.5. Give me Michigan plus 14.5 here. I think they get the cover because they want to, like, you know, keep up with Ohio State, quote unquote, because I know they had a close game with Oregon. So that's my logic behind it. Give me Michigan plus 14.5.
Um, I don't know with Oregon minus 9.5. I'm gonna go a little bit alternate on this one. I don't like this. I don't like the number. I think Michigan is probably going to keep it close, knowing my luck. But I think this game's just tough for me to tell because you expect Michigan to keep it close with their defense, but at the same time, the games that we expected them to keep it close, like games like Washington and Illinois, they got beat down in those games and they just looked really bad offensively. And we know that's been a problem for them all season. I don't know. Oregon's looked a lot better of late. Ever since they beat Ohio State, the last two games have been against Purdue and Illinois. Not, Purdue's obviously not great. Illinois has been a fine team this season, but they beat them by 29, and Michigan lost to that team by 14. So I'm very scared that Michigan might get cooked in this game, but it is at the Big House, so I will give the Wolverines the benefit of the doubt. I will go with Oregon minus 9.5. I could very well see Michigan covering this game as well for this matchup. The next game that we have, Johnson, we have a big time rivalry in the SEC that has been kind of one side the last couple of years as the game is being played in Jacksonville, as it usually has been for its entire rivalry history. Florida takes on the number 2 ranked Georgia Bulldogs, with Georgia being a 16.5 point favorite. The over under set at 52.5 for this game.
Georgia minus 16.5. Again, this is not in the swamp. If it was in the swamp, it would be a different story, but give me Georgia minus 16.5 here. I think they'll cover for these.
And I'm going to ride with you on that one. I think at Georgia minus 16.5. And keep in mind, Trevor Etienne, the former starting running back for Florida, faces his former team. Expect him to get a lot of carries in this game, maybe 2 touchdowns. I might even want to put that on my card. I'm going to put Etienne to get 100 rushing yards and a touchdown this game. First time ever Johnson player prop for the Mushing Hour.
Quite bold. I'll give you triple points if you get that next week. All right.
Okay,
The
you
next
heard it
game
here.
we have the Louisville Cardinals going into South Carolina to take on Clemson, the number 11 team in the country. Clemson at home is 11.5 point favorite. 61.5 is the slated over under. Give me Clemson minus 11.5 because Louisville's not that good.
And you know what they're not really good at, Johnson? Their defense has been really bad this
Yep.
season.
Yep.
They have
Yep.
been
Yep.
giving up points on points on points, which is why I'm going to ride with you with Clemson minus 11.5, and I'm going to go with the over as well in this game. I expect a big time game between these two teams in the ACC. Now, moving on to our next game, maybe a trap game for this team, Johnson, the SEC, is number 10 Texas A&M, after their big win over LSU, is now going on the road to take on South Carolina. The Aggies go into this game as a 3.5 point favorite on the road. The over-under set at 46.5. What do you got for this game?
I got to roll with my Aggies. Aggies minus 3.5 here. I think I said that they're going to be a college football playoff team beginning of the year. They're on
You
track
did?
to do that, so give me the Aggies minus 3.5.
Uh, I'm going to go with that as well. I'm going to go A&M minus 3.5, and I will also go with the over in this game, too. I think this will also be a nice high scoring affair between these two teams. Now that I said that, it's probably going to go under because I've already taken 3 overs so
About to
far
be a
this week. So
slugfest now.
yeah, so it might be a most likely. I think the only concern for A&M is what is their quarterback play going to be this week? Are they going to start Marcel Reed after what he did in the second half, or
I
will
think
they
they
go
start
back to
Wegman
Wegman?
still.
You think they go back to Wegman?
I still think so. Jury's still out on him.
So if he's, I guess maybe you start him, and then if he starts to like kind of play
Taper off.
bad, then
Yep. 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 Yep.
you bring him in. Yeah, I can get
Precisely.
behind that. All right. What's our next game, Johnson? Big
We
matchup in
have
the
number
ACC.
Yeah, big matchup. Number 18 in the country, Pittsburgh, going on the road into SMU, number 20 in the nation. That's weird saying that, too. Pitt is the number 18 team in the country, but they're in a 7.5 point road dog, so that means SMU is a 7.5 point favorite here. Over underslated at 59.5, and I think this is disrespectful to Pitt, so give me Pitt plus 7.5 here. I don't know
Well,
if it went out right, but they're going to cover.
there's a reason, Johnson, that this game is where it's at right now. Pitt's quarterback Eli Holston is currently questionable to play in this game, so I think that's where they have this line set at. I don't know if they trust the backup quarterback for Pitt that much in this game. He got hurt in the last game against Syracuse, so that is the big reason why the line might be set where it's at. For that reason, I want to go with an alternate spread. I want to go with SMU minus 5.5. I think this is a better time as any for the Mustangs to get this win. And crazy to think that if they win this game, they set themselves at the top of the ACC with Miami. There's a really good shot that SMU is playing Miami at the end of the season for the ACC championship game. I mean, who would have thought that when we went into this season? But that's
Absolutely
real.
no one.
That's a realistic chance. I mean, SMU has played phenomenal this season. Their one loss is to a very good BYU team in the Big 12 that is currently undefeated as well and a top 10 team.
But
So,
they could be getting the death penalty. Maybe not death penalty, but they could be getting sanctions, so make it count.
well, definitely not death penalty. We don't want that again for
Yeah,
SMU.
yeah,
We
definitely
want to see
not.
them thrive like their old glory days in the 80s. But we'll see if they can win that game. I got SMU minus 5.5 as my pick for that one. And then the final game, Johnson, is obviously the big game of the week, a huge matchup in the Big Ten. Number 4 Ohio State goes on the road to take on number 3 Penn State. We don't know the stats of Drew Aller for this game. He is questionable. We'll see if he does play. If he is able to play, Johnson, does that factor into your decision between these two Big Ten Goliaths, if you want to call them that?
So, in my opinion, I think Drew Allen. I don't think this injury is going to matter at all because what does James Franklin do best?
Yeah, he doesn't win the big games, unfortunately.
Doesn't win the big game. So give me OSU -4.
Well, I think the only good thing, Johnson, for Penn State after this game is that they have winnable games afterwards. So it's not as if they lose this game that they're out of the college football playoff. They just have to, render the storm afterwards. They have to avoid a second loss if they want to make it. If they win this game, then they're automatically in. If they lose this game, they're still not out of it. They're probably still in, if I had to guess. Unless they lose one of the last four games, which on paper, they probably shouldn't. And I think the same goes for Ohio State too, because even if they lose this game, I know it's a second loss and it puts them out of the Big Ten title game. But if they win, they're automatically in. They lose, they still have chance to make up some ground because they play Indiana, who's currently undefeated and ranked, and of course the game of Michigan would probably matter for a multitude of reasons. Obviously, a big rivalry game, but also maybe a factor for the college football playoff. I really, really would like to see Penn State win this game. I fortunately agree with you. I think this is a spot where they probably lose. However, I'm not going to make a pick on the game. I'm going to go with the under on this game. I think the biggest thing for these two teams has been their defenses all season. Ohio State had that one miss factor against a very good Oregon offense. Penn State's offense has now looked great this season. I think that this is a game where the defenses are going to shine, especially an early kickoff. Maybe see the defenses play a big factor into this one. If I had to pick who's going to win this game, unfortunately, I do think it's going to be Ohio State. But if this is probably as best a chance for Penn State to win this game because isn't as I don't want to say they're high powered, but Ohio State hasn't looked, deadly to where you think, okay, crap, they're going to win the national title this year. This could be Penn State's best chance, maybe in years, since maybe they had Saquon Barkley to beat Ohio State and get a big game and finally put that on the resume for them to be one of those top premier teams in the college football world. So we'll see how that unfolds on Saturday, early kickoff at 12 o'clock in Happy Valley. But that does it for Week 10's Mushing Hour, Johnson. Any final thoughts before we wrap this one up and get ready for next week's slate, as well as getting ready to see the first college football playoff poll released next Tuesday?
We have 1 month left of regular season college football, and then we're gonna peak in about 7 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, and that's all downhill from there. And there's a lot
Wow.
of different storylines emerging of who can actually make a difference this year around, what new teams can make the playoffs, what dynasties are going to fall, and we're gonna have all those answers by the end of November.
I think the best part about this season right now, Johnson, is I don't think there's right now a clear cut favorite to win the national title. I think it's
Nope,
that.
and it feels like
I think it's
that,
very wide open.
and it feels like the first way since like 2007.
Right, like Georgia, like some of those teams in the SEC, like Georgia and Texas, and those feel like the teams you want to pick, but they've had their faults this season. They haven't looked like as dominant in some of their games. So that's why I say it really could be that more wide open than ever. And, now that I say that, we probably have a repeat champion from previous years, but hell, who knows? It could be anyone's ball game this year in the college football world. And with a 12-team format, I think anything is realistically possible once we get to the last couple weeks of this season, going into championship week, and of course, bowl season. So should be a next great month left in this season, as well as we are now getting closer to November football. And when it gets to November, that's when these teams really have to pick up their cases to making into the college football playoff world. So we'll see if they are able to do that. But that is going to do it for this week's edition of the All Gas No Break Sports Show. Week number 9 in the books. We now head into week number 10. Some big matchups as well this upcoming weekend. We have Oregon and Michigan, big rivalry game between Florida and Georgia. Texas A&M goes on the road against South Carolina. Big matchup in the ACC between Pitt and SMU. And of course, the big matchup in Happy Valley between Ohio State and Penn State. How will all this unfold, and how will it lead to making a big impact into next week's college football playoff poll? You have to tune in on Tuesday on ESPN to see how that unfolds, and tune into our show next week on Monday, when you're listening to it on Tuesday, I should say. But next week, we will be recapping week 10 of the season, as well as giving our predictions as to the first college football playoff poll of this year. This has been Nicholas Pavone, joined alongside by my co-host Andrew Johnson for the All Gas No Break Sports Show. Have a great rest of your weekend.